So what we've been doing now is we've been setting ourselves up to secure an application in WebLogic. So typically with WebLogic, we deploy Java EE based applications. Those applications typically use declarative security to protect resources within that application. Now, declarative security usually involves defining a deployment descriptor with security entries that protect resources such as a URL or a servlet. And that declarative security identifies not only the resource to protect, but who to grant access to. And that usually comes in the form of a role or a group. And there are two types of deployment descriptors depending on the type of application that you're deploying. If you're deploying an EAR, you'll have an application.xml, which is the standard Java EE deployment descriptor, and you'll have a WebLogic version of that deployment descriptor. And that WebLogic version augments the Java EE standard application.xml deployment descriptor. So what we're going to do is we are going to define a security policy for the main web application in this domain. So to do that, let's switch back over to the admin console. Okay, let's go ahead and log in. So right now what we're going to do is we're going to protect the example web application using a custom role and policy. So when I let's click on this tab here in my browser. And every time we start the admin server, this page pops up. This page is the home page for that example web application, that main web app application. And it's wide open. Anybody can access this. There's no security on this. So what we are going to do is we are going to apply some security to this. So go back to the admin console and let's go to the deployments page and take a look at the main web app. And you can see here from our previous lab that we had deployed a version of this application 2.0. Go ahead and click on it and take a look at the security model. So when we deploy this application, we did not specify the security model. The default security model as defined by this domain is DD only, deployment descriptor only. So when I deploy an application using this option, this default option, WebLogic applies security that is defined in the deployment descriptor, and it will not allow you to override that security model for that deployment. So if it's not defined in the deployment descriptor, then you're stuck. You can't override it. So the deployment descriptor may define the name of the role that's protecting a resource. You cannot change the name of that role if the model is DD only. You can, however, define that role within WebLogic and define the conditions for creating that role. So what I want to do is I want to be able to use the admin console to override the security settings, the security model for a deployment. So for instance, let's say you're handed an application deployment archive by development or QA that contains a security model and its deployment descriptor that's unsuitable for production. Well, you can override that model and protect resources that you define in the admin console. Or let's say that development produced an application that had no security defined. The admin can certainly define security using the admin console. So in order to do that, I need to delete this deployment and redeploy it using a security model parameter that will allow me to redefine security for the application. That was a mouthful, so let's just go ahead and delete this deployment and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So check the box next to the main web app and click delete. So after you've deleted the 2.0 version, go ahead and delete the 1.0 version as well. So check this box. This is going to cause us problems if we don't delete it. Check the box for the other main web app version and click delete. Okay, so we see the confirmation that the deployments were deleted. go ahead and verify that. So I don't see main web app anymore here. All right, so now let's redeploy that main web application. So go ahead and click install. And let's navigate to that main web app 2.0 version install directory. So go ahead and click on export. And then check the radio button next to main web app 2.0 and click next. Accept the default for installing this deployment as an application and click next. Now this is the important page. So for this deployment, you can see that the default selection here is to use DD-only security, which uses only roles and policies that are defined in the descriptor. Well, I don't want that. I want to be able to define my own policy and roles. So go ahead and click on the radio button for custom roles and policies. Notice the other option though, which is custom roles. So what custom roles means is that we'll use the policies that are defined in the deployment descriptor, but we'll define the associated role within the admin console. And that role will be associated or tied to that policy. Okay, so check the radio button for custom roles and policies and scroll down and click next. And then finish. All right, so once the application is deployed, we see that the browser pops up again with the home page for that application. Switch back to the console. And you can see that we're now on the settings overview page for main web app. So what we want to do is, now that we've deployed this so that we can define a custom role and policy, so now what we're going to do is we're going to protect the entire application by defining an application scoped role. And to do that, we click on the security tab for the web application. And on the security tab, you can see that there are application scopes, URL patterns. So we can define policies and roles that are scoped to an application or to a URL pattern. So we're going to define an application scoped role first. So on the roles subtab, click new. And let's give this role a name. Let's define this as sample app user role. Now notice the provider name, Zacamel Role Mapper. This is the default role mapper within WebLogic. Zacamel is the standard for defining access in XML. And you can actually export Zacamel policies with it from WebLogic that you can use in other environments and other application servers, not just WebLogic, since it is standards based. So go ahead and click OK. So now that we have our role, go ahead and click on it. And when we click on it, we're shown the conditions page. This is where we define the conditions for the security role. And the condition that I want to define for this role is I want to associate a group with this role. I want to allow a group that we've created, to have access to the application using this sample app user role. To do that, go ahead and click on the Add Conditions button. And then from the predicate list, click on this list and you can see the various types of conditions that we can define for this role. We can define when access is allowed. We can allow access to everyone. We can deny access to everyone. You know, there's several others here. Deny access when the server's in development mode, or allow access when it's in development mode. I want to allow a group to have access to this role, to be in this role. So select group and click next. Now the group argument name is the name of the group. And unfortunately, you actually have to type in the name of the group. You cannot select it from a list. So we are only going to allow administrators access to this example's web application. So go ahead and type in the name of the group, which is simply administrators with a capital A, and make sure you click add and then finish. And then don't forget to click save. Now, if I wanted to, I could have multiple conditions here and I can negate. So what I've just done is I've stated that administrators are not allowed in this role. And so if this role is applied to a policy that protects the application, administrators will not have access to that application. So go ahead and unnegate that and click save. Now, using the breadcrumbs, let's navigate back to the Roles tab for the application and click on the Policy subtab. So now we have to define a policy that will protect the application. And it's here that we need to associate, if you recall, a policy is what protects a resource. In this case, our resource is the application. So go ahead and click on Add Conditions. And our condition is that of a role. So select Role and click Next. And enter the name of the role that we just created, which is Sample App User Role. And click Add. Then click Finish and click Save. So the application should now be protected by the security policy. This policy defines a condition that says only the sample app user role has access to the application, and the sample app user role defines a condition that says the administrators group is in that role. So let's test this new policy by accessing the application. However, first I need to invalidate my login session. So go ahead and click Log Out in the browser. And let's close the browser window altogether. Open up an entirely new window and log in to the application. Now, don't use the admin port. Don't use HTTPS, because the application isn't listening on that. If you try that, localhost :9001, and then if you recall, the application, the context root for the application is the root URL, and hit enter, you're going to get a 404 error. If you recall, applications run on either the unsecure or the secure listen port, not the admin port. The admin port's only for administrative traffic. So go ahead and let's click back on the address bar and switch this out to HTTP and 7001. And hit enter. I am now prompted to log into the application. We didn't have to do this before. Since we've applied the policy that states that only users in the administrators group have access, WebLogic has defaulted using a browser challenge. And so we now need to log in. So I can log in. If I log in using my SQL user account, SQL user and the password was WebLogic123. We know for a fact that this user is not in the administrators group. Try to log in. So it kicks us back. It says that the credentials were incorrect. Go back to your terminal window and take a look at the audit log. You can see that user SQL was denied. So let's switch back to the browser and log in as WebLogic, WebLogic123, and this account should be in the administrators group. And it is. I now have access to the application. So that's the end of this lab. We've covered quite a bit. This is a pretty long lecture and a pretty long lab, and I feel like there are 1,000 other security topics that we could have covered within WebLogic. These tend to be the most common ones. Securing your WebLogic domain, and there are other things that we can do within WebLogic to secure that domain. But most importantly, SSL, administration ports, and then understanding roles, groups, and policies to protect WebLogic resources. Those are very important. And those are the most common security items that you may come across when you're working with WebLogic.